So much, Mike and Sabina, for that absolutely wonderful, wonderful song. We're in the book of 2 Corinthians, chapter number 9, and what would happen if Christians really took God at His word concerning giving? What would happen if Christians really took God at His word concerning giving? You see, it would seem as though the path to prosperity is to protect your assets. At all cost, protect your assets. But God says differently than that. I see these commercials on television that say things like, protect your assets by investing in gold. And the Bible says, protect your assets by investing in God. Investing in God means giving it away. That's the truth. Investing in God means giving it away. I want to give you a few verses. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 9 and 10 say this: honor the Lord with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. Proverbs 11:24-25 say this: there is that scattereth, and yet increaseth, and there is that withholdeth more than is meet, but tendeth to poverty. The liberal soul shall be made fat, and he that watereth shall be watered also himself. So you see, in other words, here is sort of the oxymoron, so to speak. The one who gives is the one who really ends up having. The one who gives is actually the one who ends up having more. Proverbs 19:17. He that hath pity upon the poor lendeth unto the Lord, and that which he hath given will he, that is the Lord, pay him again. Proverbs 28, verse 27. But he that giveth unto the poor shall not lack, but he that hideth his eyes, he shall have many a curse. Malachi 3:10. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouses, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. So you see, to fail to give generously, and obviously giving generously, what does that look like? Well, that's going to be somewhat different for every person. But nevertheless, what from you would be generous, okay? To fail to give generously is to fail to walk by faith rather than by sight. Walking by sight and not by faith will always keep you from giving. Walking by faith rather than by sight will always cause you to give more. We see in the very last verse of the previous chapter, chapter 8, we see in the very last verse there a very, very simple truth, and that is that giving proves love. Giving proves love. Look at verse 24 of chapter 8, where Paul writes, wherefore show ye to them and before the churches the proof of your love and of our boasting on your behalf. You know, the Bible stresses over and over again that when it comes to love, you can talk about love all day long, but the proof is in the pudding. That's all there is to it. The proof is in the pudding. It is never enough for Christians to simply talk about love. We should talk about love, talk about God's love, talk about love, 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 how much we need to love, how much we do love. But at the end of the day, love doesn't smell real unless you're showing it, unless it's being demonstrated. Romans 5:8 says, "But God commendeth his love towards us." Commendeth means that he loved us so much that, get this, he actually did something about it. He actually acted on it, even though the sacrifice of his Son cost him everything. Likewise, therefore, you and I are to be imitators of God. So if God commendeth his love, then you and I are to commend our love through the sacrifices that we make for others. Listen to 1 John 3:17 that says this, "But whoso hath this world's good, and seeth his brother have need, and shutteth up his bowels of compassion from him, how dwelleth the love of God in him?" So 1 John 3:7 reminds us that the love of God in us, the quote, love of God in us, is directly proportional to our generosity in the context of, quote, this world's good. So the extent to which the love of God dwells in you is proportional to the extent to which you are generous with, quote, this world's good. This world's good refers to our material resources. And at the end of the day, it essentially means money. James chapter 2 reminds us that our faith itself, our faith is invisible. You cannot see our faith. But the proof of our faith, the impression our faith makes, now that is anything but invisible. The proof of our love is in what we choose to do with what God gives us. Our love, our faith, the, quote, love of God in us, it's all sort of like the wind. See, the wind itself is invisible, but you know it is there. How do you know it's there? Because of the impact it's having on whatever is around it. The movement of the tree limbs or the movement of the grass. Its effect on others is how it gets seen. So also our love is seen by its impact on what we do with our money. Even though our giving is, of course, extremely private, but we see it, and so also does God. Point number 2, giving is integral to the ministry. We see this in verse number 1 of chapter 9, that giving is absolutely integral to the ministry, and because our giving, our collective giving of all of us, because it is integral to the ministry, it is something that deserves to be emphasized. It is absolutely appropriate to emphasize it. For Paul writes in verse 1, "For as touching the ministering to the saints, it is superfluous for me to write to you." Okay, what does that mean? Here's what that's saying. This is kind of like Paul saying, now I don't even need to talk about this, but then he spends the next 2 whole chapters talking about it. I don't even need to say anything, but here's a couple chapters for you. In other words, when he writes, "It is superfluous for me," translate that as, I know I'm preaching to the choir here. That's what he's saying. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but the reason why sometimes we might talk about something, the reason why sometimes we might emphasize something, is because even if that something doesn't happen to be an issue or doesn't happen to be a problem at the moment, it simply is something that always deserves to be emphasized. Just always does, in both good times and in bad times. Why? Because it is just that important, and because it is simply that pertinent. That's why he's saying here, This is not the most pressing issue at this moment, but it always deserves its day. It always deserves its moment. It always deserves to be emphasized. See, there are some doctrines that honestly could be considered something like side dishes, meaning it is acceptable for that doctrine to receive very little emphasis. I suppose an example might be angelology. Angelology is the study of angels. That might be something that a Christian might appropriately call a side dish. So when it comes to giving, we might desire for giving to be one of those less important side dishes. But it can't be, because the Bible emphasizes it. And the Bible emphasizes it by emphasizing both the blessings of giving and the necessity of giving. Bible emphasizes both the blessing that will come upon the giver and how necessary and important our giving is. See, unless God's people are generous givers, they will not be blessed. And ultimately, at the end of the day, neither will anybody else either. Because God has chosen not to rain down resources out of the sky, not to use angels, but God has chosen human instrumentality. And human instrumentality means your hands, your mouth, and yes, your wallet as well. Number 3, giving sets an example. We see this in verse 2. Christians are never ever going to lack bad examples to learn from. There will never be a day in which Christians will have a dearth of bad examples for them to learn from. So that's not even the question. The question is always going to be whether or not there's going to be sufficient good examples for Christians to learn from. And here we see that giving can set a good example. We see in verse 2, "For I know the forwardness of your mind, for which I boast of you to them of Macedonia, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal hath provoked very many." So what Paul says here is this: their generous giving provoked more generous giving from others. He also writes here that he even, quote, boasted of the generous giving of one church to another church. Generous giving does get noticed, and the impact of generous giving absolutely gets noticed. Because you see, nothing happens in a vacuum. Nothing happens and has no effect on all that is around it. Everything starts some sort of a chain effect. Everything has an impact on everything going on around it. Now, I'm not talking about individual giving, because again, individual giving is seen by no one. However, everyone's corporate giving is seen, and that does make a difference everywhere. And by virtue of the fact that our corporate giving is seen, it is therefore able to bring glory to God before the eyes of other people, and furthermore able to, quote, provoke others to give as well. See, giving begets more giving. That's all there is to it. Giving always begets more giving. I say always. I suppose sometimes, maybe not, but that's terrible, because you see, any time giving does not beget more giving, any time in which the generosity of others is actually used as an excuse to not give, it's always because the person was already not at all enthusiastic about giving in the first place. For example, let's say someone looks at a spreadsheet and says, "Oh, this church has lots of money. Well, I guess they don't need any more." See, no degree of giving would have ever provoked such a person as that to give. But that's not a spiritual person already, and that is that person's problem. However, when a spiritual person sees that others are giving generously, and sees that that money is being well invested in the work of the kingdom, my friends, that is going to provoke such a person to always want to get on board that train, to always say, hey, this is awesome and I want to be a part of it. Number 3, failure to give as committed brings shame and discouragement. Look at verses 3 through 5. Yet have I sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this behalf, that, as I said, ye may be ready, lest happily if they of Macedonia come with me and find you unprepared, we, that we say not ye, should be ashamed in this same confident boasting. Therefore I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren, that they would go before unto you, and make up beforehand your bounty, whereof ye had notice before, that the same might be ready as a matter of bounty, and not as of covetousness. Okay, so the churches of Macedonia, they had made a specific commitment in the past. And I imagine that they may have meant like a specific amount that they had intended to give. And that can be a wonderful thing. It can be a wonderful thing for a person to have preset goals that they set for themselves. Just like it can also be wonderful for churches to have goals for themselves in terms of their giving to missions. These goals might take the form of dollar amounts, or these goals might take the form of percentages. But what matters most is not what the goal is. What matters most is that there are goals. That it's not just pure stagnation, because there are goals, there are intentions, there are higher levels to be reached. Now, goals need to be both. On the one hand, they need to be realistic so as to not bring about discouragement. Because if you set unrealistic goals, then when you don't meet them, everyone's going to be terribly discouraged. But while they need to be realistic, they do also, of course, have to be challenging. Because if they're not challenging, then there's no purpose in even having them. So goals can be a wonderful tool for helping us to maintain discipline in our lives. And here is what I mean by that word, discipline, especially in the context of giving here. Giving should not be sporadic. What I mean by giving being sporadic is you give, then you don't give for a real long time, and then suddenly you do again, and then you don't again. Giving should not be fickle, meaning, hey, if I'm in a good mood and things are going my way, then I'll give. And when life is hard, then my giving 100% disappears. It's not good for a Christian's giving to be flimsy, to be up and down or all over the place. What is so important in your giving is the discipline that is able to bring about what you might call a dependable consistency. A dependable consistency. Now, when it comes to giving extra, well then obviously it's fine to be spontaneous or unpredictable. When it comes to just giving something extra out of the blue, that's not what I'm talking about. But when it comes to your regular giving, what counts for so much, at the end of the day, counts more than just what you gave overall over the course of 10 years, was your dependable consistency all along the way. Even when circumstances may force the dollar amount to change, there can still be some level of dependable consistency. Do you remember the moral of that old story, the tortoise and the hare? Remember that? The rabbit could run faster, but he could not keep it up. The rabbit, though he had the ability to sprint, lickety-split, but he was so easily distracted. The rabbit was up and down and all over the place, while the turtle, on the other hand, the turtle, He didn't have speed, but you know what he did have? Dependable consistency. That's what the turtle did have. Dependable consistency. He always kept going. You could not count on the turtle's speed, but you could always count on this. He was always moving. He was always moving. When it comes to your giving, sure, to some degree, spontaneity can be a wonderful thing. But what is most foundational is this: steady dependency, steadiness. Galatians 6:9 says this, "And let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not." That means even when life is hard, stay the course, stay the course, stay steady. And just as that's true in every way, it has an application to giving as well. Then we see that giving is at odds with covetousness. Giving is always at odds with covetousness in verse 5. As a matter of bounty, not as a matter of covetousness. So, covetousness will, of course, keep you from giving, and also, to some extent, giving will help keep you from covetousness. Unsatisfaction, discontentment, a longing for more materially. Christians buy into what the world says we are supposed to have. So, here are a few simple ideas or principles or tips to help keep your materialism at bay. As long as you live in a body of flesh, it won't be in a state of non-existence, but to at least help keep your materialism in check. Keep it at bay. Number one, deny yourself something every once in a while. Deny yourself something every once in a while. See, sometimes, here's what we do. We tell ourselves that we know that having that nice thing will not make us happy. But nevertheless, even though we claim we know that very well, every time there is a nice thing that we can afford, we buy it. Now, not being materialistic does not mean that we never, ever buy ourselves something nice. It's not a sin to buy yourself something nice once in a while. But what we do is we stretch that wiggle room to its absolute limits by always buying ourselves the things that we want. You say that you realize you don't have to have it, but here's what might be a good idea. At least every once in a while, prove it to yourself. Every once in a while, prove it to yourself. And here's how you prove it to yourself. Once in a while, don't buy it. Just don't. Not because you can't afford it. Maybe you can afford it. Not because it would be some terrible sin for you to buy it. It wouldn't be a terrible sin. But just solely to prove to yourself. You might just have to remind yourself once in a while that you truly don't need it. Number two, don't look at the rich, look at the poor. Don't look at the rich, look at the poor. If you always look up, then you're going to see yourself down. But if you look down, then you will see yourselves up. If you look at the poor, you'll never, ever feel bad for yourself. And maybe there's someone hearing me say this right now and say, Pastor, you don't understand. I am the poor. and you know what? There was always poorer. That's the truth. There was always poorer. There was always poorer. And if you choose to focus on those who have more than you, if that's where your focus is, you'll always feel bad for yourself, and it will never bring happiness. But if you choose to focus on those who have less than you, well, that will keep your materialism at bay. Hebrews 13:5, let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as ye have. For he hath said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. 2 Peter 2:14 sinners who have, Peter writes, quote, a heart exercised with covetous practices. Next point, God's blessings are going to be proportional to how you give. Look at verse 6. But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. When you take the time to plant a seed, it is by faith, so to speak, that you trust that that investment in the future will pay back one day with dividends. It is by faith that you believe that that tiny seed that you plant is going to accomplish something. Now here, in this verse, planting a seed is used as an analogy or an illustration for financial giving. And in the same way that planting more seeds today is going to bear more fruit tomorrow, so also the more generously you give today, the more generously God will bless you in some way, shape, or form tomorrow. That as you give is how it will be given to you. The more seeds you plant, the greater the harvest is going to be. Do you remember that historical character, Johnny Appleseed? Remember that guy? Huh? He went around planting apple seeds everywhere he went. And he saw that as an investment in the future. Well, as a consequence of his actions, long after he was no longer alive, lots of people had apples to eat. So also, when you invest in the work of the kingdom, today's seed will be tomorrow's fruit. We see in verse 7 that giving helps us experience God's love. Every man according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. You know, the greatest thing in the whole wide world is to be the object of God's love. That's the greatest thing in the whole wide world. Jude 1:21 says, keep yourselves in the love of God. Now, let's break down every word of verse 7. First, he writes, every man. Every man has the same opportunity to experience God's favor through giving. That opportunity is given to everyone. It's not limited to those who have more. According as he purposeth. So as he predetermines ahead of time. Giving is a decision of the will. It is something that cannot be coerced. In his heart. Isn't that what he says? In his heart. That means that even though it's a decision of the intellect, it's a decision of the will, it cannot purely be a decision of the will. It has to also include a person's emotions. So let him give. Meaning, well, that's what he ought to give. And he's under no man's judgment for it. We see here that the motives is always more important to God than the amount. Because then he writes, not grudgingly, which means to do something while holding a grudge. It means to do something reluctantly. To do something reluctantly. He says not of necessity, meaning not under compulsion or forced to. It has to be voluntary. God doesn't draft. He looks for volunteers. What matters is that the giver is, quote, cheerful. That's what matters. And do you know what it means to be, quote, cheerful? To be full of cheer. That's right. Cheerful means full of cheer. Cheerful comes from the Greek word hilaros, from which we get our English word hilarious. See, a person is never happier than at the moment in which they are laughing. A Christian should be at their absolute most happiest when they are giving. What we see in this verse is simply this. Joyous givers, those who give joyfully, are sort of like God's cheerleaders. God's cheerleaders. Have you ever seen a cheerleader frown? Raise your hand if you've ever seen a cheerleader frown. I mean, could you imagine a reluctant cheerleader? Go team, go team. Go, go. No, no, no. That's not what a cheerleader. And to be God's cheerleader, it says that God, quote, loveth such a person. See, God's love is for all people, just like the sunshine is for all people. But while the sunshine is there, not everyone goes outside and basks in it. So also, God loves all, but some Christians choose to bask in it. And there are many different ways to bask in the light of God's love, but giving is an indispensable way of doing so. So bottom line, how serious you take the fact that God loves you can very much be seen in how much of a generous giver you are. We have seen today that on the one hand, our giving needs to be sacrificial and disciplined, while at the same time has to be cheerful and loving. So is that you? Are you sacrificial and disciplined in your giving? But at the same time is the reason why, because you're so cheerful and loving. Come forward at this invitation. Kneel at this altar and say, God, make me a cheerful and loving giver. As we stand to our feet and sing this hymn of invitation together, you come forward as God has spoken to your heart.